What if the most important secret of the ancient world was not buried in stone, but carried in the air? What if certain civilizations, separated by oceans and millennia, stumbled onto the same vibrational science? Is it possible that ancient builders knew sound at the right frequency could alter the mind, fill a chamber with standing waves felt by the body, and lift objects no hand could carry? Could the lost science of frequency be the key to buildings we still cannot replicate? If this mystery is pulling you in, please like and subscribe and turn on your notifications so you never miss an investigation. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We are reading every single one. The story you are about to hear is built from 3 layers of evidence. The first layer is the physical architecture of the ancient sites themselves. Sites where modern researchers have measured acoustic resonances that match nothing in the ordinary range of natural rock formations, and that match each other across continents. The second layer is the body of recorded testimony, some of it from credible witnesses, some of it from witnesses whose claims must be carefully weighed. That ancient and traditional cultures applied sound deliberately to manipulate matter in ways that current physics is only beginning to formalize. The third layer is the science of acoustic levitation as it is being practiced today in the laboratories of Tokyo, Stanford, Bristol, and a handful of other research institutions where engineers have demonstrated that focused sound can, in fact, lift objects against gravity. The science is real. The ancient sites are real. The testimony is contested, and the convergence between them is what we are here to examine. Across the last 2 centuries of archaeology, a quiet pattern has emerged that the textbook timelines of human prehistory cannot fully explain. The pattern is this: from the underground temples of Malta to the passage tombs of Ireland to the labyrinthine galleries of the Peruvian highlands, there are stone chambers that respond to sound in unusual and consistent ways. They resonate at frequencies that fall within a narrow range, a range whose lower boundary sits near 70 Hz and whose upper boundary sits near 120 Hz. That range, by remarkable coincidence or by remarkable design, happens to be the same range in which the human male voice produces its lowest sustained tones. It is also the range in which modern neuroscience has documented measurable changes in brain activity. Whoever built these chambers, working in eras separated by thousands of years and divided by oceans they could not have crossed, somehow arrived at the same engineering target. They built rooms tuned to the human voice. They built rooms that, when sound entered them at the right pitch, did things that the people standing inside them would never forget. What follows is an investigation into how this happened, why it happened, and what it might mean. The answers will not be neat. Some of them will be supported by peer-reviewed measurements taken by university research teams. Some of them will be drawn from the ambiguous edge where eyewitness testimony sits next to physical evidence that resists easy interpretation. We will move from the demonstrated to the contested to the merely suggested, and at every step we will keep the categories clear. Because the lost science of frequency is not a single thing, it is a body of related claims, each requiring its own treatment, and each refusing to dissolve when the standard archaeological narrative tries to wave it away. The camber that resonates at the frequencies of the human voice. Beneath the modern town of Paola on the Mediterranean island of Malta, 3 levels deep into the soft globigerina limestone of the local bedrock, there is a structure that has no equivalent anywhere else in the world. It is called the hypogeum of Hal Saflieni. It was rediscovered by accident in 1902 when workmen digging a cistern for a new house broke through the ceiling of an underground chamber, whose existence had been entirely forgotten. The workmen, alarmed at having damaged something old, initially attempted to hide the discovery. The structure beneath them eventually proved to be the only known prehistoric subterranean temple on Earth. The hypogeum was constructed beginning around 4000 BC and developed across a period of roughly 1500 years. By the time of its abandonment around 2500 BC, the complex had grown to at least 3 vertical levels, carved entirely into the bedrock, with multiple chambers connected by passages, niches, alcoves, and false doorways. The architecture, as later researchers have noted, mirrors the megalithic temples that the Maltese were building above ground in the same period. But the hypogeum reverses the relationship. The walls are not stones placed against the sky. They are negative spaces cut into the rock. The ceilings are not roofs raised above the floor. They are surfaces left behind where the surrounding stone has been removed. The architectural term for this kind of construction is architecture in the negative. The hypogeum is its earliest known and most complete example. Approximately 7,000 human skeletons were eventually recovered from the chambers of the hypogeum during early 20th century excavations. The complex appears to have served as both a place of communal burial and a place of ritual activity. Visitors to the site today, descending the modern access stairs and walking through the carved corridors, often comment on the silence of the place. The corridors muffle sound. The chambers swallow it. But in one room, on the second level, the silence breaks. The room is informally known as the oracle chamber. Standing inside it and producing a low sustained tone, particularly with a male voice in the bass register, produces a response from the room itself that is difficult to describe and impossible to forget. The first systematic study of this acoustic property was undertaken in 2014 by a team led by the Italian researcher Professor Paolo De Bertolis of the University of Trieste, in collaboration with the Maltese composer Ruben Zara and the American researcher Linda Anake of the OTS Foundation for Neolithic Studies. Their published findings, presented at the first conference on archaeoacoustics convened by Annex's organization, documented a strong double resonance frequency in the oracle chamber at approximately 70 Hz and 114 Hz. A male voice tuned to either of those frequencies, the researchers reported, stimulates a resonance phenomenon throughout the entire hypogeum. The sound, once initiated in the oracle chamber, travels through the connected corridors and is amplified and sustained in ways that have no easy explanation in the natural acoustic properties of limestone. Echoes inside the structure have been measured at durations as long as 8 seconds. Some observers have reported the sensation of the sound waves passing through their bodies. The Portuguese archaeologist Fernando Coimbra, who participated in the testing, recorded his subjective experience of the sound in his notes. He described the feeling of the tone moving through his body at high speed and producing a sensation he characterized as deeply relaxing, with the impression that the sound was being reflected from his torso onto the painted spirals on the walls of the chamber. The painted spirals matter. The hypogeum's walls bear traces of red ochre decoration, some of which has survived for nearly 5,000 years in the protected underground environment. The spirals and curvilinear designs on the chamber walls are not random ornamentation. They appear to follow patterns that some researchers have suggested map the acoustic standing waves of the chamber itself. Whether this interpretation is correct or speculative, the visual association between the painted patterns and the sound behavior of the room is striking enough to have prompted serious academic attention. But the most consequential finding of the hypogeum studies is what happens to the human brain in the presence of these resonant frequencies. In 2008, a separate research team led by Dr. Ian Cook at the University of California, Los Angeles, published findings from a controlled experiment in which volunteer subjects were exposed to a series of tones in the 90 to 120 Hz range, while their brain activity was monitored by electroencephalography. The findings were specific and they were striking. At a 110 Hz, and only at that frequency, the patterns of activity over the prefrontal cortex of the subjects shifted abruptly. Activity in the language centers of the left hemisphere of the brain decreased. There was a temporary shift toward right hemisphere dominance. The hemisphere associated by some neuroscientists with emotional processing, intuitive cognition, and certain nonverbal mental states. At neighboring frequencies, 90 Hz, 100 Hz, 120 Hz, no such effect was observed. The brain response was specific to a narrow band centered near the resonance frequency that the hypogeum's oracle chamber appears to have been engineered to produce. The implication is significant. The Maltese builders of approximately 4000 BC, working with stone tools and without any access to modern neuroscience, somehow constructed a chamber whose primary acoustic resonance falls at the precise frequency that produces a measurable shift in human consciousness. They could not have known the chamber would do this. Or they could have known. The orthodox archaeological position holds that the resonance is incidental, an accidental property of the chamber's particular dimensions and the qualities of the local limestone, and that the brain effect is a coincidence. The alternative position, advanced by the archaeoacoustic researchers, holds that the resonance was intentional, that the builders identified the effect through repeated experiment, and that the hypogeum was deliberately constructed as an instrument for inducing altered states of consciousness in those who used it. Between these two positions lies a great deal of unsettled ground, but the measurements themselves are not in dispute. The chamber resonates at the frequency of the male voice. The frequency alters the brain. The chamber was built 5,000 years ago. Usepet. The passage Tom and I reel in the Tet does the same thing 3,000 kilometers northwest of Malta. On the Boyne River in modern Ireland, there's another stone chamber whose acoustic properties match the hypogeums with an exactness that no easy explanation can fully cover. The structure is called New Grange. It was built around 3200 BC, which makes it slightly older than the Great Pyramid of Giza and considerably older than Stonehenge. New Grange is a passage tomb. It consists of a long stone-lined corridor extending 60 feet into a great earthen mound, terminating in a cruciform inner chamber with a corbelled stone ceiling that rises nearly 20 feet above the floor. The site is most famous for its astronomical alignment. On the morning of the winter solstice, and only on that morning, a narrow shaft of sunlight passes through a precisely cut roof box above the entrance, travels the length of the 60-foot corridor, and illuminates the inner chamber for approximately 17 minutes before retreating back along its path. This alignment has been functioning without human maintenance for more than 5,000 years. The precision of the orientation is at the very edge of what can be achieved with the surveying tools available to a Neolithic culture. It is, by any reasonable measure, an engineering achievement of the first order. What is less famous but no less remarkable is what happens when sound is produced in the inner chamber. Beginning in the early 1990s, researchers including the British archaeoacoustic specialist Aaron Watson and the team operating under the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Program, led by Dr. Robert John, conducted a series of acoustic surveys at New Grange and several other prehistoric chambered sites in the British Isles. The Princeton team's findings were published in 1995 in a technical report titled Acoustical Resonances of Assorted Ancient Structures. The findings, when laid alongside the later Maltese measurements, formed a pattern that has not yet been adequately explained. New Grange resonates within a narrow range. The strongest acoustic response of the inner chamber falls between approximately 90 Hz and 120 Hz, with the peak resonance very close to 110 Hz. A male voice singing or chanting at that frequency inside the chamber produces standing waves that fill the room and extend back along the passage toward the entrance. The sustained acoustic effect is not subtle. Visitors who have been allowed to test it report sensations that range from physical tingling to spatial disorientation. The Princeton report documented similar effects at 4 other megalithic chambered structures in the British Isles, all of them dating to roughly the same Neolithic period, and all of them resonating at frequencies within the same narrow band. New Grange and the hypogeum are not the products of a single culture. They are not connected by any documented trade route or migration pattern in the period of their construction. The Maltese builders were a small island population descended from the early agricultural settlers of the central Mediterranean. The builders of New Grange were the Neolithic farmers of the Boyne Valley, descended from the populations that had crossed the Channel into the British Isles roughly 2,000 years earlier. There is no archaeological evidence of cultural contact between these two groups during the period in which both sites were being constructed. They were not in conversation. They had not visited one another. They could not have shared engineering plans, and yet they built chambers that resonated the same frequency, that produced the same physiological effects on the people inside them, and that appear to have been engineered for the same general purpose. What does this mean? There are 3 possibilities. The first is coincidence. Perhaps the chambers happen to resonate at 110 Hz because that frequency falls within the natural acoustic response range of medium-sized stone enclosures, and any culture building a chamber of approximately the same dimensions and approximately the same materials would arrive at approximately the same resonance. This is the most conservative interpretation. It does not explain why the brain effect is specific to this frequency, but it does account for the convergence without requiring any shared cultural knowledge. The second possibility is convergent discovery. Perhaps both cultures, working independently, noticed that certain stone chambers produced unusual sound effects, and that those effects induced unusual states of mind. Both cultures, recognizing the value of the experience, would then have refined their architecture to maximize the acoustic response, arriving by separate paths at similar engineering solutions. This is more interesting, but still does not require any shared inheritance. The third possibility is shared origin. Perhaps both the Maltese and the Irish builders were drawing on a body of acoustic knowledge that had a common source older than either of their cultures. A source whose own origin has been lost. A tradition transmitted in some form, by some route, from a deeper past that the standard archaeological timeline has not yet identified. The third possibility cannot be proven from the chambers alone, but it cannot be dismissed either, because the same pattern, with regional variations, appears at additional sites across the ancient world. And the more sites we examine, the harder coincidence becomes to defend. The pattern continues in Egypt, in some of the most studied and most contested chambers ever constructed. The King's Chamber inside the Great Pyramid of Giza has been the subject of acoustic measurement for more than a century, and the results have been remarkably consistent across the various studies. The chamber is a rectangular room of polished red granite, measuring approximately 10.5 meters long by 5.25 meters wide by 5.75 meters high. The walls are constructed of massive granite blocks fitted together with such precision that, in many places, a knife blade cannot be inserted between them. Above the chamber, 5 additional smaller chambers, known as the relieving chambers, were constructed for purposes that remain debated. The whole assembly sits embedded in the mass of the pyramid, 200 feet above ground level, surrounded by millions of tons of limestone. What modern measurements have demonstrated is that the King's Chamber, despite its construction in the 3rd millennium BC, exhibits acoustic properties unlike any of the surrounding spaces in the pyramid. The chamber resonates with extraordinary clarity at frequencies in the same narrow band, documented at the hypogeum and Newgrange. Researchers, including the engineer Christopher Dunn and the acoustic specialist John Stuart Reid, have conducted independent measurements at different times across the past 30 years, and the findings have repeatedly converged. The dominant resonance of the King's Chamber falls in the range of approximately 100 to 120 Hz, with sustained reverberation times that exceed what would be expected from the chamber's volume alone. The granite itself appears to amplify and sustain certain frequencies in ways that limestone does not. Some researchers have proposed that the choice of red granite for the King's Chamber, when limestone was used for almost every other internal surface of the pyramid, was a deliberate acoustic engineering decision. The granite was selected in this reading because it produces a fundamentally different acoustic environment from the surrounding stone. The granite sarcophagus at the center of the King's Chamber adds a further layer to the puzzle. The sarcophagus is empty. It has no lid. It has no inscriptions. It is cut from a single block of red granite hollowed out with such precision that modern industrial metrology equipment has confirmed its interior surfaces are flat to within fractions of a millimeter. When struck with the open hand or with a soft mallet, the sarcophagus rings with a clear, sustained tone. The fundamental frequency of the tone, measured by multiple researchers, falls at approximately 440 Hz, the standard concert pitch A in modern Western music. The harmonics of the sarcophagus, however, extend down into the lower frequency range that activates the chamber's own resonance. When the sarcophagus is struck and the chamber begins to resonate sympathetically, the result is a complex, layered sound environment that has been described by witnesses as physically overwhelming. What the sarcophagus was for, like the chamber that contains it, has never been satisfactorily explained. The Egyptological orthodoxy holds that it was the tomb container of the pharaoh Khufu, and that the chamber and pyramid were built as his royal burial complex. The orthodoxy struggles, however, with the absence of any human remains, with the absence of any inscription connecting the sarcophagus to Khufu, and with the apparent acoustic engineering that would seem to serve no purpose for a sealed burial chamber that was supposedly meant never to be reopened. Why build a resonant chamber that no one was ever supposed to enter again? Why hollow a granite sarcophagus to acoustic specifications if its only purpose was to contain a mummy? The questions have no settled answers. A different category of evidence comes from the underground complex at Saqqara known as the Serapeum. The Serapeum consists of a long underground corridor flanked by side chambers, each containing an enormous granite sarcophagus. The sarcophagi at the Serapeum are not small. Each one weighs between 70 and 100 tons. Each is cut from a single piece of granite. Each has internal dimensions and surface tolerances that, like the King's Chamber sarcophagus, exhibit machining precision that the orthodox dating of the 18th dynasty cannot easily account for. The Serapeum sarcophagi, when struck, produce sustained tones that resonate within the underground chambers and along the connecting corridor. The acoustic properties of the complex have not been studied as systematically as those of the hypogeum or Newgrange, but preliminary observations by researchers who have visited the site report effects in the same general frequency range. The official explanation for the Serapeum is that it served as a burial complex for the sacred Apis bulls of Memphis, and that the granite boxes were the tomb containers of the bulls. The explanation has the same problem as the King's Chamber sarcophagus. No bull remains have ever been found inside the boxes. The hieroglyphic inscriptions on the exterior of the sarcophagi appear, on close examination, to have been added later, carved with less precision than the surfaces they decorate. Some researchers have argued that the boxes are pre-Egyptian, manufactured by an earlier culture using methods we do not yet understand, and inherited by the 18th dynasty Egyptians who added their own inscriptions to objects whose original purpose had already been forgotten. If this reading is correct, the Serapeum joins the king's chamber on the growing list of Egyptian acoustic chambers, whose original function was something other than burial. They were instruments. The Egyptians of the 18th dynasty inherited them, as we have inherited them, without fully understanding what they were originally meant to do. The Egyptian acoustic evidence extends beyond the obvious cases. Inside the Great Pyramid, the so-called Grand Gallery is a long, upward-sloping corridor lined with polished limestone blocks fitted together so tightly that modern laser scanners have difficulty detecting the seams. The Grand Gallery, when viewed as an acoustic structure rather than an architectural feature, exhibits properties consistent with a deliberately tuned resonator. Its dimensions are precise multiples of fundamental wavelengths in the frequency range that would activate the king's chamber above it. Some researchers have suggested that the gallery was designed not as a passageway but as a sound conduit, channeling acoustic energy from a source point at the lower end up to the resonant chamber at its termination. The eponymous impersonation remains preliminary, but the geometric correspondence between the gallery's dimensions and the king's chamber's resonant frequencies is striking. Whether by accident or by design, the pyramid's internal architecture appears to function as a coordinated acoustic system. Outside the pyramids themselves, the Osirian at Abydos provides another data point. The Osirian is an underground stone structure of unusually massive construction, carved or assembled from large granite blocks below the surface of the desert near the Temple of Seti I. Its origin is debated. Mainstream Egyptology dates it to the 19th dynasty, around 1200 BC. Some alternative researchers have proposed that the Osirian is far older, possibly predating the dynastic period entirely. Whatever its date, the structure's interior chambers exhibit acoustic properties that have not been fully characterized, but that visitors and preliminary researchers have reported as consistent with the larger pattern documented at other ancient sites. The Osirian has not received the systematic acoustic study that the Hypogeum and Newgrange have received. Whether it joins the broader list of resonant ancient structures in any rigorous sense remains a question for future research. What the cumulative Egyptian evidence suggests is that the architects of the Old, Middle, and possibly pre-dynastic Egyptian periods were aware of the relationship between stone, geometry, and sound, and that they applied that awareness in their major monumental constructions. The acoustic engineering was not the explicit purpose of every chamber, but it was a recurring feature of the most sacred and most precisely constructed spaces. Whoever was overseeing the technical construction of these monuments understood that certain configurations of polished granite, certain dimensions, certain proportions would produce specific sound effects. They built accordingly, whether the resulting acoustic environments were meant for ritual, for the induction of altered states, for the manipulation of matter through resonance, or for some combination of these purposes, is a question the surviving evidence has not yet answered. What is clear is that the chambers were not silent by accident. Enormous men in black suits were on their feet. In the Yucatan jungle of southern Mexico, at the Mayan ceremonial center of Chichen Itza, there are structures that produce some of the strangest acoustic effects ever documented in any pre-modern building. The site was constructed by the Maya in stages between approximately 700 and 1200 AD. Its central pyramid, called El Castillo or the Temple of Kukulkan, rises in 9-step terraces to a height of 30 meters. The pyramid is famous for the serpent-shaped shadow that descends its northern staircase on the spring and autumn equinoxes, an astronomical alignment as precise as the solstice alignment at Newgrange. What is less famous but acoustically more remarkable is the chirped echo of the pyramid staircase. When a hand is clapped at the base of the great staircase, the echo that returns is not a simple reflection of the sound. It is a downward chirped frequency, a sound that descends in pitch as it returns. The phenomenon has been measured by acoustic researchers, including David Lubman of the Acoustical Society of America. The staircase, by virtue of its repeated step structure, acts as a phased acoustic reflector that processes the incoming impulse and returns it as a frequency-modulated reply. The return sound has been described as resembling the call of the Quetzal bird, an animal that the Maya considered sacred and that features prominently in Mayan religious iconography. Whether the architects of the pyramid deliberately tuned the staircase to produce a Quetzal-like echo is debated. What is not debated is that the echo exists, that it is consistent across measurements, and that it would have been audible to anyone clapping or making sharp sounds at the base of the structure during ceremonial use. A second acoustic feature at Chichen Itza occurs at the Great Ball Court. The court is the largest in Mesoamerica, measuring 168 meters long by 70 meters wide, with stone walls rising 8 meters on either side. A whisper produced at one end of the court is audible with remarkable clarity, at the other end 168 meters away. The acoustic transmission cannot be easily explained by ordinary sound propagation. Researchers have proposed that the parallel stone walls, combined with the precise dimensions of the court, create a focused waveguide effect that channels sound across the entire length of the structure. The Maya, in this reading, built the ball court not only as a venue for their famous ritual game, but also as an acoustic instrument that allowed communication between the players and the priests at opposite ends of the field. A third effect occurs at the so-called Group of 1,000 Columns, an extensive courtyard surrounded by stone columns that stand in a regular grid pattern. Sound produced in the columns' space exhibits unusual reverberation characteristics that have been compared to the standing wave patterns of large modern concert halls. The Maya, it appears, were systematically designing their ceremonial spaces with sophisticated acoustic awareness. They were not building blindly. They were tuning their architecture to produce specific auditory experiences for the participants in their rituals. What this adds to the larger pattern is a fourth independent confirmation of the same principle. The Maya, building in a continent and an era completely separate from the Maltese, the Irish, the Egyptians, and the Andean Shaban culture, also engineered their major sacred sites for acoustic effect. They tuned their pyramids. They tuned their ball courts. The convergence across all these cultures cannot reasonably be ascribed to coincidence. Whatever else was happening, the deliberate engineering of resonant ceremonial spaces was a recurring feature of major civilizations across the entire ancient world. The Stonehenge acoustic studies. The pattern reaches its most studied modern site at Stonehenge, the megalithic complex on the Salisbury Plain in southern England. Stonehenge was constructed in stages between approximately 3000 and 1500 BC. The arrangement consists of an outer ring of standing sarsen stones connected by horizontal lintels, an inner ring of blue stones, and an inner horseshoe of taller trilithons. The site has been studied for more than 400 years. The astronomical alignments have been documented in extensive detail. The construction methods have been the subject of decades of experimental archaeology. What has only recently begun to receive systematic attention is the question of how Stonehenge sounded. Beginning in 2012, the British acoustic researcher Bruno Fazenda of the University of Salford, in collaboration with archaeologist Rupert Till, conducted a comprehensive acoustic study of Stonehenge. The challenge was that most of the original structure no longer stands. The standing stones we see today represent perhaps half of what was originally there. To reconstruct the original acoustic environment, the research team built a full-scale replica of Stonehenge in concrete in the state of Washington, in the United States, and conducted acoustic measurements there. They also developed sophisticated computer modeling that simulated the sound behavior of the complete original structure, based on the surviving stones and the documented positions of those that have since fallen. The findings were striking. Stonehenge, in its complete form, would have functioned as a deliberate acoustic enclosure. The arrangement of the stones, the height of the lintels, the geometry of the inner horseshoe, all combined to create a space that produced controlled reverberation and selective amplification of sounds within its perimeter. A speaker standing at the center of the circle would have been heard with unusual clarity by listeners along its edges. Sounds produced inside the circle would have been substantially reduced in volume by the time they reached the outside, suggesting that the stones served partially as a sound barrier separating the ritual space from the surrounding plain. The reverberation times measured in the modeled and replicated environments fell within the range that modern concert hall designers would consider acoustically pleasing. Stonehenge, in other words, was an early acoustic auditorium, designed by its Neolithic builders to produce a specific sound environment for the rituals that were performed inside it. What is most striking about the Stonehenge findings is that they emerge from a culture that, in the standard archaeological account, is supposed to have been pre-literate, pre-mathematical, and possessing only the most rudimentary technological capabilities. The builders of Stonehenge were the same population that had built Newgrange 600 years earlier. They were the descendants of the same Neolithic British farming culture, and they were, the acoustic evidence now suggests, applying the same principle of deliberate acoustic engineering across multiple ceremonial sites across many centuries. This was not a one-time accident. This was a tradition that involved specialized architectural knowledge transmitted across generations of builders, applied with consistency refined over time. The technology was real. The transmission was real. The loss of the knowledge, when it eventually occurred, did not erase the buildings. And it is the buildings that have allowed us, in the last few decades, to begin reconstructing what the builders knew. The Stonehenge studies also raised a question that connects back to the broader pattern. At what frequencies would the original structure have resonated most strongly? The acoustic modeling of the complete Stonehenge has not produced as definitive an answer as the studies at the Hypogeum or Newgrange, in part because so much of the original is missing and the reconstructed values are necessarily approximate. But preliminary findings suggest again that the dominant resonant frequencies fall within the same narrow band that has now been documented at every major megalithic acoustic site so far studied. Somewhere between 90 and 120 Hz, centered close to 110 Hz. The frequency of the male voice. The frequency that affects the brain. 5 sites, 4 continents, 5,000 years of construction history, the same engineering target. Whatever else can be said about coincidence and convergence, this much is now certain. The deliberate engineering of resonant chambers tuned to a specific narrow band of audible frequency was a recurring practice in the major civilizations of the ancient world. It was not invented once and forgotten. It was discovered, applied, refined, and rediscovered repeatedly across the long arc of pre-modern human history, and the cultures that practiced it, despite all the differences in their material technology and their religious belief systems, were doing something that we are only now beginning to understand. But before we leave the catalog of documented acoustic sites, there's one more case that belongs in this discussion. It is the most distant from the others, both geographically and culturally, and it provides perhaps the most striking single demonstration of the pattern we have been tracing. The case in question lies high in the Peruvian Andes, where Stanford University researchers have spent the last 2 decades reconstructing what may be the most thoroughly understood ancient acoustic technology yet recovered. The work at the site has produced peer-reviewed publications, doctoral dissertations, and a body of psychoacoustic experimentation that has begun to shift what mainstream archaeology accepts as plausible about the technical capabilities of ancient ceremonial cultures. The Peruvian Sound Labware. Across the Atlantic. In the high northern Andes of Peru, there is a complex of stone galleries that takes the acoustic mystery into a different register. The site is called Chavín de Huántar. It sits at an elevation of approximately 10,000 feet in a steep mountain valley, 350 kilometers north of modern Lima. The site was occupied as a ceremonial center from approximately 1500 BC to 400 BC, which makes it roughly contemporary with the late phase of the Hypogeum's use and predating most of the classical civilizations of South America. Chavín's most striking architectural feature is not its surface buildings, although those are impressive. It is the network of underground galleries cut into the bedrock beneath the temple complex. The galleries are narrow. They are intentionally labyrinthine. They twist, branch, and double back in ways that produce extreme spatial disorientation in anyone who walks through them. Beginning in 1995, a long-term archaeological project led by John Rick of Stanford University began systematic excavation and study of Chavín's underground spaces. In 2001, Rick's team made a discovery that would reshape the understanding of how the galleries had been used. In one of the gallery chambers, the team recovered a cache of 20 decorated marine shell trumpets. The trumpets were not from a local source. They had been made from the giant conch shells of the species Strombus galeatus, a tropical mollusk whose habitat lies more than 500 miles to the north along the Pacific coast. Each trumpet had been cut, polished, and modified with a mouthpiece. Each bore decorative carvings indicating ritual significance, and each was more than 3,000 years after their last use, still playable. The trumpets are called Protutis. In 2008, Rick's team partnered with Stanford's Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics to study the relationship between the Protutis and the architecture of the Chavín galleries. The collaboration was led by the doctoral researcher Miriam Kohler, who would eventually defend her dissertation on the acoustic environment of the site. What the Stanford team discovered was a precise correspondence between the resonant frequencies of the Protutis and the resonant frequencies of the underground galleries. The trumpets, when sounded inside the galleries, did not simply make noise. They activated the architecture. The galleries had been built, the team eventually concluded, to be played by the Protutis. The acoustic effects observed in the Chavín galleries are stranger than the effects at Malta or Newgrange. When 2 Protutis are sounded simultaneously at slightly different pitches, the galleries produce a phenomenon called acoustic beating. a low pulsing throb that occurs when two close frequencies interfere with each other. The architecture appears to enhance and sustain this beating effect. Listeners standing in different positions within the galleries cannot reliably tell where the sound is coming from. In some locations, they wildly misidentify the direction of the source. In other locations, their perception is accurate. The architecture creates, in Kohler's published description, phantom instrument guides. The sound seems to come from places where no instrument is being played. The walls themselves seem to speak, combined with the spatial disorientation of the labyrinthine layout, and combined with the fact that participants in Chavan rituals are believed to have ingested mescaline-containing San Pedro cactus extract. The acoustic environment of the galleries appears to have been designed as a comprehensive sensory technology for inducing altered states of consciousness. The participant entered the galleries in semi-darkness. They were dosed with a powerful psychoactive substance. They moved through narrow corridors whose geometry confused their sense of direction. They were surrounded by sound that seemed to come from multiple impossible locations. They were, by any reasonable description, being deliberately disoriented through the integrated application of architecture, drug pharmacology, and acoustics. Whoever designed this had understood, 3,000 years ago, that the human mind could be manipulated through controlled sensory input. They had built the rooms accordingly. The Stanford findings at Chavan have been published in multiple peer-reviewed venues, including in collaboration with the Acoustical Society of America. The findings are not contested in the way that some earlier archaeoacoustic claims were contested in the academic literature. The galleries do what they are described as doing. The Pututus produce the frequencies they are described as producing. The phenomenological effects on listeners are documented through controlled psychoacoustic experimentation, conducted on site. Miriam Kohler's doctoral dissertation on the integrative archaeoacoustics of Chavan, defended at Stanford and now widely cited, has become a foundational text in the emerging field of archaeoacoustic study. Whatever else can be said about the broader question of ancient acoustic technology, the Chavan case has moved out of the contested zone and into the established archaeological record. The galleries were instruments. The Pututus were the means of playing them. The participants who entered the spaces were having engineered experiences whose nature can now be partially reconstructed through modern acoustic measurement. Chavan sits, geographically and temporally, far outside the cultural sphere of either Malta or the British Isles. The site predates the Inca Empire by more than 1,500 years. It is older than the Roman Republic. The acoustic engineering on display there cannot have been borrowed from any of the other sites we have examined, and yet it operates within a frequency range that overlaps with the Maltese and Irish examples. The resonance peaks of the Chavan galleries fall within the same narrow band that the Princeton team had documented in the British megalithic chambers. The targeted frequency, again, falls within the range of the human male voice, the range that produces measurable changes in human brain activity. 3 sites. 3 continents. 3 cultures that did not know each other. The same engineering target. The same physiological effect. This is the pattern, and the pattern, at a certain point, demands an explanation. The Tibetan Slaney. We move now from sites that can be measured to claims that cannot. Because the lost science of frequency, if it is real, did not stop at the production of altered consciousness in stone chambers. According to a body of testimony that is contested but persistent, certain ancient and traditional cultures applied sound to a far more extraordinary purpose. They used it to move stone, to lift it. The most extensive single account of this kind comes from a published text by a Swedish civil engineer named Henry Kelson in a book titled In Swedish Forsvunnen Teknik, which translates as The Lost Techniques. Kelson published the book in 1961. He had spent his professional career as a senior engineer in the Swedish aviation industry, including work on the early Saab aircraft programs. He was not a fringe figure. He was a credentialed engineer with a reputation in his field, but the book he wrote in his later years contained material that the engineering community did not know how to receive. The central account in the book concerns a man Kelson identified as Dr. Jarl, a Swedish physician who had studied at Oxford in the early 20th century, and who had befriended a young Tibetan student during his time there. According to Kelson, the Tibetan student returned to his home country and eventually rose to a high position in a Tibetan monastery. In the late 1930s, Dr. Jarl was working in Egypt on behalf of the English Scientific Society when he received a request from his old friend, now a senior figure in the monastery, asking him to come to Tibet to treat a High Lama. Jarl traveled to the monastery by aircraft and then by yak caravan. He stayed for several weeks. During his stay, his Tibetan friend, who had grown to trust him, took him to a remote meadow surrounded by cliffs and showed him something that, according to Gelson's account of Jarl's account, no foreigner had ever been allowed to witness. In the meadow was a polished stone slab with a bowl-shaped depression cut into its center. The depression measured 1 meter in diameter and 15 centimeters deep. A second stone block, a roughly rectangular piece of cut stone measuring 1 meter wide and 1.5 meters long, was maneuvered into the depression by yak oxen and positioned so that it sat in the bowl. At a distance of 63 meters from the slab, the monks arranged 19 musical instruments in an arc spanning 90 degrees of the surrounding meadow. The arc consisted of 13 drums and 6 trumpets called ragdons. The drums were not small. 8 of them measured 1 meter across and 1.5 meters in length. 4 were medium-sized. One, the smallest, had a particularly sharp tone. Behind each instrument, 200 monks lined up in straight rows of 8 or 10, in what Gelson's text described as the configuration of spokes in a wheel. When the signal was given, the instruments and the chanting monks began to produce a coordinated sound. According to the account, the volume and the tempo of the noise increased gradually for approximately 4 minutes. Nothing happened. Then, at the 4-minute mark, the stone block in the bowl-shaped depression began to rock. Within seconds, it took off into the air. It traced a parabolic path approximately 500 meters long, rising to a height of 250 meters, and landed on a ledge in the cliff face where the monks were apparently constructing a wall. The flight took, according to the account, 3 minutes. The monks then brought another stone to the meadow, positioned it in the bowl, and repeated the procedure. They moved approximately 5 to 6 stones per hour in this manner. Some stones split during the process. The split fragments were carried away. Dr. Jarl, the account claims, found the experience so contrary to what he understood to be possible that he initially suspected he was hallucinating. He filmed the procedure on 2 separate occasions. The films, according to the text, confirmed exactly what he had seen. The English society to which the films were eventually submitted classified them as restricted material, and they have never been publicly released. This account presents a problem of evidence that requires acknowledgement. The story has not been independently verified. Dr. Jarl's full identity has never been confirmed in primary sources. The films, if they exist, have not been made available for examination. The English Scientific Society has no documented record of the relationship Gelson described. The narrative chain runs from an anonymous monk in Tibet to a partially identified Swedish doctor to a Swedish engineer who published the account decades after the event was supposed to have occurred. By the standards of conventional historical evidence, the case is not strong. Many critics have pointed out that Gelson's account contains internal inconsistencies, including geometric specifications that some researchers have argued are incompatible with the physics of the events described. Others have suggested that the account represents either an embellishment, a misinterpretation, or an outright fabrication on the part of one or more of the parties involved. But the account refuses to be dismissed entirely. Gelson was a precise engineer. The specifications he reported include particular dimensions, particular distances, particular ratios between the sizes of the instruments. The detail is suspicious in its very precision, but the precision is also what makes the account unusual within the broader literature of stories about ancient or hidden technologies. Gelson, unlike most popular writers on these topics, attempted to give exact figures. He drew diagrams. He described the geometric arrangement of the instruments and the monks in numerical terms. Whether his figures correspond to a real event or to a fabricated one, he was treating the question with the precision of a working engineer rather than with the looseness of a popular storyteller. The Tibetan account stands, therefore, in an unusual evidentiary position. It cannot be confirmed. It cannot be conclusively dismissed. It sits in the contested zone between testimony and demonstration, where the standards of evidence used in conventional historical analysis do not produce a clean verdict. What is clear is that Gelson believed what he was reporting. What is also clear is that the account, once published, entered the broader cultural memory of speculation about ancient sound-based technologies. It has been cited, repeated, debated, and elaborated for more than 60 years. The persistence of the account in itself is a fact of cultural history regardless of whether the underlying event ever occurred. And the account is not unique. Similar traditions exist elsewhere. The medieval Arabic historian Al-Masudi, writing in the 10th century, reported that the builders of the Egyptian pyramids had moved stones by placing them on papyrus scrolls inscribed with certain characters and then striking them with a rod, after which the stones rose into the air and traveled to their destinations. The Egyptian priest historian Manetho, writing in the 3rd century before the Common Era, preserved a tradition that an instrument called a chianef, generally translated as some kind of horn or trumpet, had been used in the construction of the great monuments of his country. These traditions, like Jelson's account, do not constitute proof. They constitute a pattern across multiple cultures, separated by centuries and continents. There are persistent traditional accounts that ancient builders used sound or vibration as part of the construction process for monuments that modern engineering cannot fully explain how they assembled. The traditions may be myths, they may be misinterpretations, or they may be the degraded oral memories of techniques that were once practiced and that have since been lost. The modern science of acoustic levitation. If the ancient and traditional accounts of acoustic levitation seem to belong to the realm of legend, it is worth noting that acoustic levitation is not, in any sense, an impossible phenomenon. It is, in fact, a well-established and intensively studied modern science. In laboratories at the University of Tokyo, at Stanford, at the University of Bristol, at Bath, and at a dozen other research institutions around the world, engineers have demonstrated for decades that focused ekendrity can lift small objects against the force of gravity and hold them suspended in midair indefinitely. The physics underlying the phenomenon is well understood. The applications are expanding. The principles are real. The technique is called standing wave acoustic levitation. It works by directing 2 or more ultrasonic transducers at each other across a small gap. The transducers produce coherent sound waves that interfere as they meet, creating a standing wave pattern with stationary nodes of low pressure and antinodes of high pressure. A small object placed at one of the pressure nodes experiences a net upward force from the pressure differential surrounding it. If the object is lighter than the threshold the acoustic field can support, it is lifted into the node and held there, suspended, against gravity. The object can be moved by adjusting the phase relationships between the transducers, which shifts the position of the standing wave and carries the suspended object with it. Modern systems can manipulate small particles, water droplets, and even small living organisms in 3-dimensional space using this technique. The most famous demonstrations have come from the laboratory of Yoichi Ochiai at the University of Tokyo, working with Takayuki Hoshi at the Nagoya Institute of Technology and Jun Rekimoto at Sony Computer Science Laboratories. In 2014, the team published a paper in the journal PLOS One describing a system that used 2 opposed arrays of ultrasonic transducers to manipulate millimeter-sized polystyrene particles in 3-dimensional space. The videos of the demonstrations show small white spheres floating in midair, moving in complex patterns, responding to the directed acoustic field with the precision of objects held by invisible hands. The objects in question are small. The largest particles successfully manipulated by the Ochiai system measured 2 millimeters in diameter. But the principle is not size limited. Larger systems, using more powerful transducers and more sophisticated phase control, can lift correspondingly larger objects. The University of Bristol's research group has demonstrated levitation of objects with diameters and weights several times the wavelength of the sound being used, including objects in the millinewton range, well above what was thought to be the theoretical ceiling of the technique a decade ago. What modern acoustic levitation cannot yet do is lift a 1-ton stone. That much should be acknowledged. The energies required are far higher than anything the available transducers can produce. The frequencies required for efficient levitation of objects at that scale would have to be much lower than the ultrasonic range, which would in turn require enormous physical structures to generate the necessary wavelengths. The engineering problems are not, in principle, unsolvable, but they have not been solved. The gap between what modern science can demonstrate and what the Tibetan account claims is large. 2 qualifications are worth making, however, about that gap. The first is that modern acoustic levitation has been the subject of serious research for less than a century. The first laboratory demonstrations of the principle were conducted in the 1930s. The serious development of the technology has taken place mostly in the last 4 decades. We are at an early stage of understanding what acoustic energy can do. The history of physics is full of phenomena that were considered impossible or impractical at one stage of development and routine at another. The second qualification is that modern laboratory acoustic levitation operates in ordinary air at ordinary atmospheric pressure. The acoustic environment of an ancient temple chamber With its precisely engineered geometry, its standing wave-supporting walls, and its concentrated source array configuration, is not the same as a laboratory bench. We have not yet constructed, in any modern facility, a chamber the size of the hypogeum or the Newgrange passage tomb, and tested whether the same configurations the ancient builders may have used could amplify acoustic effects beyond anything we have currently demonstrated. The question of what would happen in such a chamber, with the right frequencies, with the right human voice, with the right number of resonating sources arranged in the right geometry, has not been seriously investigated by modern science. We do not know what we do not know. There is one further consideration about the modern research that deserves mention. The current generation of acoustic levitation systems uses ultrasonic frequencies, well above the range of human hearing, for a specific engineering reason. Higher frequencies produce shorter wavelengths, and shorter wavelengths allow for more precise control of the standing wave nodes where objects can be suspended. This makes the laboratory work tractable, but it also means that all current laboratory acoustic levitation operates in a frequency range that has nothing to do with the human voice or the audible range that the ancient acoustic chambers were tuned to. If the ancients were doing acoustic manipulation at much lower frequencies, in the range of the chanting and instrumental performance documented at Chavin and reportedly conducted at the Tibetan monastery, they were operating in an acoustic regime that modern laboratory science has barely touched. The lack of modern demonstration at those lower frequencies does not, in itself, mean that the lower frequencies could not produce the effects claimed. It means only that the question has not been seriously asked in a modern experimental setting. There is no laboratory anywhere in the world that has attempted to replicate the Tibetan configuration. There is no facility that has assembled 200 chanters around 13 large drums and 6 trumpets and tested whether the resulting acoustic field, properly aimed, can produce vertical force on a stone block. The experiment has simply not been done. What we do know is that the underlying physics is genuine. Sound can lift objects. The principle is established. The engineering question is whether the principle can be scaled, and the historical question is whether some ancient civilization, working in conditions we have not yet adequately reconstructed, found a scaling solution that we have not yet recovered: the Florida stonemason. The most peculiar single piece of evidence in this whole inquiry comes not from the ancient world, but from the 20th century. In 1923, a Latvian immigrant to the United States named Edward Leeds Kalnin began the construction of a stone monument on a small piece of land he had purchased in Florida City, in the southern part of the state. Over the next 28 years, Leeds Kalnin would single-handedly quarry, shape, and erect more than 1,100 tons of coral rock. Individual blocks of his construction weigh between 3 and 30 tons. The entire project was carried out by one man. Leeds Kalnin stood 5 feet tall. He weighed approximately 100 pounds. He had no formal engineering training. He worked alone, at night, by lantern light, and he refused to allow anyone to observe him while he was working. The completed monument is called Coral Castle. It now sits in Homestead, Florida, where Leeds Kalnin relocated the entire structure block by block in 1936, a feat that was witnessed by a number of local residents but never explained. Visitors today can walk through the castle. They can examine the stones. They can see for themselves the level of engineering involved. One block, the so-called 9-ton revolving gate, was balanced so precisely on a central iron rod that for several decades a child could push it open with a single finger. The bearing on the gate eventually wore out in the 1980s. When engineers from the Florida Department of Transportation attempted to repair it, they were unable to reproduce the original balance. They could make the gate functional. They could not make it move with the effortlessness it had originally possessed. Leeds Kalnin himself, when asked how he had moved the stones and constructed the castle, gave answers that frustrated everyone who heard them. He claimed, on multiple occasions, to have discovered the secret of how the pyramids of Egypt had been built. He wrote and published a small pamphlet titled Magnetic Current, in which he described his idiosyncratic theories of electromagnetism and what he called individual magnets. He spoke of leverage, of balance, of the principles of perpetual motion. He never demonstrated his techniques. He died in 1951 of malnutrition and stomach cancer. His methods died with him. All that remained were the stones, which cannot be reproduced today by anyone using conventional engineering. Coral Castle is not an ancient monument. It does not, in any direct sense, prove anything about the construction of the Hypogeum or Newgrange or Chavin, but it functions as a useful reminder of what a single determined human worker, possessing some particular knowledge that was not shared with the surrounding culture, can accomplish. If Edward Leeds Calnin, working alone in 20th century Florida, could produce a structure that modern engineering cannot replicate, then it becomes harder to claim that small, specialized communities of ancient builders, working with whatever specialized techniques they possessed, could not have accomplished similar or greater things in earlier centuries. The argument from impossibility becomes weaker. Leeds Calnin demonstrated in our own time that the impossible has a history of turning out to be merely uncommon. What Leeds Calnin actually knew and how he applied it has been the subject of speculation for nearly a century. Some accounts claim he was witnessed using sound or chanting in some way during the movement of the stones. The accounts are anecdotal. They cannot be confirmed. They were not recorded systematically, but they fit with eerie precision into the larger pattern of traditional accounts that connect the movement of large stones to the application of human-produced sound. Whether the connection is real or whether it is the cumulative product of human pattern recognition operating on insufficient evidence, the pattern itself is one of the more persistent threads in the recorded folklore of ancient construction. What the builders may have canned Semming Taffing. Back from the specific sites and the specific accounts, a tentative picture begins to emerge. It is a picture that orthodox archaeology will not endorse in its strongest form, but that the accumulating evidence makes increasingly difficult to dismiss in even its weakest form. The picture is this: multiple ancient cultures separated by oceans and millennia possess knowledge about the relationship between sound, human consciousness, and physical matter that exceeds what the standard timeline of technological progress allows for. They built chambers tuned to specific frequencies. They engineered architectural environments that could be activated by particular instruments and voices. They developed traditions of using sound in coordinated ways that, in some cases, may have extended to the manipulation of matter itself. The strongest version of this claim, the version in which ancient priests routinely lifted 1,000-ton stones using coordinated chanting and resonant geometry, cannot be supported by the available evidence. The Tibetan account is unverified. The medieval Arabic and Egyptian traditions are oral memories of distant events. The archaeoacoustic measurements at sites like the Hypogeum and Shavin do not, by themselves, prove that the builders of those sites could levitate objects. Anyone who tells you the case for ancient acoustic megalith moving is settled is overselling the evidence. The weaker version of the claim, however, is on much firmer ground. The weaker version goes like this. Ancient builders in multiple cultures developed sophisticated empirical knowledge of how sound behaves in enclosed stone spaces. They built chambers whose acoustic properties produced specific physiological effects on the people who entered them. They incorporated this acoustic engineering into the larger ritual functions of their sacred sites. They knew that sound, applied in certain ways, could change the human mind, and they used that knowledge deliberately and systematically. This much is supported by peer-reviewed measurements at multiple sites, by independent confirmations from researchers at multiple universities, and by a coherent body of evidence that mainstream archaeology is now, slowly, beginning to incorporate into its working models of the ancient world. Between the strong version and the weak version is a great deal of contested ground. The Tibetan account sits in that ground. The traditional Egyptian and Arabic accounts sit in that ground. The Coral Castle anomaly sits in that ground. None of them can be conclusively confirmed. None of them can be conclusively rejected. They form, collectively, a body of suggestive evidence that points towards something real, without quite reaching the standard of proof. Whether that something is the residue of a lost ancient science of acoustic engineering, or whether it is the cumulative product of human imagination working on coincidental patterns, is a question that the next generation of researchers will have to settle. The acoustic measurements are improving. The science of acoustic levitation is advancing. The conversation between these three fields, when it eventually occurs, may produce conclusions that none of the individual disciplines can reach on their own. What we can say with confidence is that the lost science of frequency, in its weaker and better evidenced form, was real. The hypogeum exists. The oracle chamber resonates at the frequency that affects the human brain. Newgrange does the same thing. Chauvin does the same thing. Builders 5,000 years apart, on opposite sides of the world, somehow arrived at the same engineering solution. Whatever their specific intentions, whatever the full extent of what they understood, they were not working at random. They were tuning their architecture to the human voice and to the human mind. And the buildings they left behind are still working, still resonating, still doing exactly what they were built to do, for anyone willing to step inside them and produce the right tone. Why the Naladige was lost. If the ancient builders did possess a developed acoustic science, the The question that follows is why we do not have it now. The answer lies in the specific nature of the knowledge. Acoustic engineering of the kind we have been describing is not the sort of knowledge that survives in libraries. It is not preserved in stone tablets. It cannot be communicated effectively through written description alone. It is, by its nature, embodied knowledge. It depends on the trained sensitivity of the practitioner, on the accumulated experience of generations of architects who could feel how a chamber would sound before they built it, and on the continuous transmission of those skills from master to apprentice within an unbroken professional tradition. Embodied knowledge of this kind is uniquely vulnerable to civilizational disruption. When a temple is abandoned and its ritual specialists die or disperse, the knowledge of how to operate it disappears within a generation. The buildings remain. The sounds remain, but the people who knew which tones to produce, when, in what sequence, with what intention, are gone. Without them, the buildings become silent. They become objects to look at rather than instruments to play. The technology, in any meaningful sense, has been lost, even though the artifact survives in pristine condition. This pattern has played out many times in the history of human construction. It is played out at the hypogeum, where the chambers sat unused for thousands of years before they were rediscovered. It is played out at Newgrange, where the alignment continued to function, but the rituals that depended on it had long since been forgotten. It is played out at Chavan, where the Patutas were left behind when the site was abandoned, and where their precise role in the acoustic ceremonies of the temple has had to be reconstructed by archaeologists and acoustic engineers working 2,000 years after the last priest of Chavan held one of them to his lips. A great flood, a catastrophe, or a deliberate effort at suppression. It only requires the ordinary mechanisms by which living traditions decay when their host cultures decline. The civilization that built the hypogeum lasted approximately 1,500 years. The civilization that built Newgrange lasted approximately 1,000. Chavan's central period ran for about 1,000 years before the site was abandoned. In each case, the knowledge of how to use the sites died with the cultures that had built them. There was no effort to preserve the techniques in a transmissible form. The buildings were the only memorial. What is unusual about the present moment is that we are, after thousands of years of silence, beginning to investigate these buildings as the instruments they originally were. Modern acoustic measurement equipment, modern brain imaging technology, and modern collaborative research between archaeologists and engineers are slowly reconstructing what the original builders knew. The reconstruction is incomplete. We do not know all the songs. We do not know all the procedures. But the chambers themselves, after their long silence, are beginning to be heard again. Philosophical reflection. There is a thought that comes out of all of this, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before we close. It is the thought that the relationship between sound and the human mind is older, deeper, and more strange than we usually acknowledge. The cultures that built the hypogeum, Newgrange, and Chavan knew something about that relationship. They organized their spiritual lives around the experiences those rooms produced. They were not mistaken in believing that sound could move them. We can confirm with modern instruments that the rooms do exactly what they appear to have been built to do. If those cultures understood the relationship between sound and consciousness so well, what else did they understand? The simplest answer is that we do not know. Some of what they knew may have been preserved in modified form within later traditions. Some of it may have been lost entirely. Some of it may sit in the gap between the strong and weak versions of the claims we have been examining, waiting for better evidence to either confirm or reject it. We are, in a real sense, in the early stages of recovery. The ancient builders were further along in this domain than we have given them credit for. The catching up has only just begun. There is also a quieter thought to carry with this. The knowledge we are talking about was not abstract. It was not something the ancient priests possessed only as theoretical understanding. It was something they used. Every day perhaps, or on every appointed festival day, they entered the chambers, produced the right tones, and experienced the effects those tones produced. It was felt in the body. It was integrated into the texture of an ordinary religious life. When that life ended, the knowledge ended with it, not because the books had burned, but because the people who held it had died, and their successors had not been trained. We, the latest civilization to walk the earth, are accustomed to thinking of knowledge as something that lives in writing, that can be archived and preserved indefinitely against any disruption. that survives the death of any individual practitioner. This is, in many domains, a real advantage, but it is also, in some domains, a vulnerability. We have not preserved everything. We do not preserve, for example, the kind of embodied tonal knowledge that the ancient acoustic engineers depended on. We do not have a tradition of training people to feel how a chamber will sound before they build it. We have outsourced acoustic understanding to specialized professionals working with computer modeling tools. And we have lost, for most of the population, the kind of intuitive ear that the ancients took for granted. If our civilization were to fall tomorrow, the libraries we leave behind would not, by themselves, transmit our knowledge. The practitioners would have to be there to interpret the records. Without them, our libraries would become like the hypogeum, full of meaning but unable to speak for themselves. This is the deeper lesson of the lost science of frequency. It is not just that some ancient builders knew things we do not know. It is that the kind of knowing they possessed was different from the kind we typically value. And the world they built, the world of resonant chambers and tuned voices and sound that could move both minds and possibly more, was a world in which knowledge lived in the body of the practitioner rather than on the shelf of the library. When that world ended, what was lost was not, primarily, a set of facts. What was lost was a way of holding knowledge that we have not since recovered. There is a particular dignity in the ancient practitioners that this story should not allow us to forget. The men and women who oversaw the construction of the hypogeum of Newgrange, of Shaven, of the King's Chamber, were not amateurs. They were specialists. They had been trained from childhood in the techniques of their craft. They had spent decades developing the trained ear that would allow them to evaluate the sound of a chamber as it was being built. They had inherited their knowledge from masters who had inherited it in turn. The lineages of training, in some cases, may have been older than the buildings themselves. By the time the chambers were completed, the people who built them had been carrying the relevant knowledge for thousands of years, across hundreds of generations. They knew what they were doing. They were exercising a developed professional competence in a domain that their cultures considered among the most important they could pursue. And the buildings they produced, judged purely on the criterion of whether they accomplished what they were designed to accomplish, are among the most successful human works ever attempted. They still function. They still resonate. They are still doing what their builders meant them to do, 4 and 5 and 6,000 years after those builders died. There is no modern building of which the same can be said with anything like the same confidence. Stand in the oracle chamber of the hypogeum. Stand in the inner chamber of Newgrange. Stand in the underground galleries of Chauvin de Huantar. Speak in a low voice. Sing, if you can, in a sustained tone close to 110 Hz. The room will respond. The walls will sing back. The sound will fill the space and move through your body and produce something you have not felt in any modern building. The effect is real. It is measurable. It was deliberately engineered by people whose names we do not know, working in cultures that have left us almost no other record of their inner lives. It is one of the most remarkable inheritances we have from the deep past, and it is sitting there, in those chambers, waiting to be experienced by whoever takes the trouble to enter and to make the right sound. The science of frequency, in the form we can verify with modern instruments, is not lost. It has been recovered. The hypogeum has been measured. Newgrange has been measured. Chauvin has been measured. The brain effects have been documented in peer-reviewed journals. The chambers have started to speak again. We are, slowly, listening. What we have not recovered, and what may never be recovered, is the larger system of knowledge of which the chambers were a part. The full procedures. The full rituals. The full understanding of why certain frequencies were chosen, and what experiences they were intended to produce, and how those experiences fit into the wider spiritual life of the cultures that built them. That part of the knowledge was held in the practitioners. It died when they died. We can reconstruct fragments. We cannot, in any complete sense, restore the system. And then there is the contested edge of the inquiry. The Tibetan account. The medieval traditions about pyramids and trumpets. The strange story of Edward Leeds Calneen. The persistent traditional claims that sound, somehow, could move stone. They sit in the territory where the boundary between testimony and demonstration becomes uncertain, and where the standards of evidence used in conventional history yield uncertain verdicts. We do not know if the strong version of the lost science was ever real. What we know is that the persistence of the claim across centuries and cultures is itself a phenomenon that requires explanation. People do not, in general, invent the same impossible story in identical form across continents and centuries, unless something in the underlying experience is generating the convergence. Maybe the convergence is simply the human imagination operating on universal architectural awe. Maybe it is the cumulative product of repeated speculation operating on common evidence. Or maybe, sometimes, the strange, persistent stories that cluster around the great ancient sites are rooted in something the standard archaeology has not yet caught up to. We do not know, but the question is open, and the chambers are waiting. Perhaps you are watching this video right now in a building that is silent. A modern home, a modern office, a modern apartment, a space whose acoustic properties were not engineered, a space designed for visual aesthetics and structural efficiency, but not for sound. This is the world we have built for ourselves. It is a world in which the air does not, generally, do anything when we speak into it. The walls do not respond. The floor does not vibrate sympathetically. The space we inhabit is acoustically inert in a way that most spaces in the long history of human architecture have not been. We have lost the ear. We have lost the room. And we have, in losing them, become a civilization that does not remember what its own buildings are supposed to do. The ancient builders remembered. They built chambers that listened. They built rooms that answered. They built spaces tuned to the human voice and to the human mind. Whatever else they may or may not have known, they knew this. And the rooms they made are still here. Still resonant, still ready to do what they were built to do, as soon as someone walks in and remembers what the right note sounds like. Perhaps the deepest question is not whether the ancients could move stones with sound. Perhaps it is whether we, the heirs to their resonant chambers, will ever again build anything that sings.